Sounds like we need a battery somewhere, man. And a fire alarm, smoke alarm. Well, tonight we will move along in the chapter of Daniel, chapter 7. We will start with chapter 7 after we've gone through the first 6 chapters of Daniel. You know, BC, of course, is up in Oklahoma visiting with Brother Kaywood's congregation, and he has the opportunity to visit with some other congregations along the way and on the way back, and reminds me of a story where there were these three. There was a small town, and there were the three preachers of the various denominations. So they would get together once a week, usually on Tuesdays, and they would all talk about everything that's going on in the small town. And so one day they went fishing on Tuesday, and they were out there in the boat fishing, and one of the preachers said, "You know, we come out here, we meet every Tuesday, we talk about what's going on in our different congregations, but you know, we really need to talk about us. And I think that we need to tell one of our weaknesses that we might have." So, and he says, "I want to go first." He says, "You know, I have a weakness that I like to gamble. I like to buy numbers for football games and things like that." He says, "I'm not a big gambler, Vegas type. I just like to buy numbers here and there." The second guy, he says, "You know, I have to admit I've cheated. You know, I haven't paid all the income taxes that I'm supposed to pay, and I don't always turn everything in like I'm supposed to on my income tax." So it was real quiet, and they said, got to the third guy, and he just kind of sat there and he didn't say anything. And the other preacher said, "Now come on, you need to tell us. We've all been honest with one of the weaknesses we have." And he was a little quiet. He says, "Look, we're not going to go back into the shore until you tell us." He says, "Well," he said, "you know," he says, "I like to gossip. I can't wait to get back into town." So anyway, a little smile to get started tonight. Let's get into Daniel. So Daniel's, I don't know if we'll get through 7 and 8 tonight, but it's what I've prepared for, 7 and 8. And, you know, Daniel had lots of dreams that he didn't understand, but at this point we come to more or less the end of the historic part of Daniel, and with the beginning of chapter 7, we're now going to go back and deal with visions that Daniel had during previous years. And this particular vision that came to Daniel was in the first year that Belshazzar was king. And if we remember in Belshazzar, which we studied last week in chapter 5, you know, who threw the big wine party and drank wine out of the treasures which his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem, and these items had been sanctified to be used in the Lord's temple only. And Belshazzar had a big party using them. So, and then our study through chapter 6 took us out to the end of Daniel's life during the reigns of Darius and Cyrus, the Medo-Persian kings. And also remember from our study last week that Daniel in chapter 6 was maybe in his 80s at that time, because remember he got taken into Babylon at a young age, and then and he stayed in Babylon through the end of the 70 years that God told them that they were going to be there. And so, but now we're going to deal with the prophecies, or with the visions that Daniel had received. And the first one here is in chapter 7, and that was when Belshazzar was in his first year as king of Babylon. So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat, and eat your fill of flesh.' And after that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. And after that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there was before me a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns." So as we read about these 4 beasts, we can immediately see their correlation with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that was interpreted by Daniel earlier. As Nebuchadnezzar had a vision of those world governing empires or those governments that would govern the world, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he saw them as an image of man with a gold head, the chest of silver, the legs of iron, stomach of brass, a head of gold, feet of iron and clay with 10 toes. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, watched in his dream, and the whole image crumbled, and the rock grew into a mountain that covered the earth. Now we have a parallel vision with Daniel, only he does not see the world governing empires as a man, but he sees them as beasts. And the lion, would of course be the Babylon Empire. It had eagle's wings that were plucked. It was lifted up from the earth, but then it was made to stand like a man. And then the second, like a bear, 3 ribs in its mouth, is the Medo-Persian Empire. And the third, the leopard, is the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great. And, interesting, when Alexander the Great died, this says that there were 4 heads. And it's interesting, when Alexander the Great died, there were 4 nations, or there were 4 empires underneath that came out of Alexander the Great. Alexander, he didn't have any children, but he did pass on a dynasty. But it was separated, and 4 of his generals, of Alexander the Great's generals, began to rule. One in Syria, one in Egypt, one in Asia Minor, and the other in Greece. And so those are the dividing 4 heads. But the last beast, the Roman Empire, is just a big beast. It says, after that in my vision I looked, therefore was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. So it had 10 horns, and so we're reminded of the 10 toes in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So you have the 10 horns coming out of the 4th beast, the Roman Empire, even as you have the 10 toes, which were part iron and part clay, showing the relationship to the Roman Empire. So we have parallel visions here. And God is again revealing the 4 world-dominating empires. But now we're going to receive some interesting enlightenment that did not come in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In verse 8 we continue, "While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So and then there's an 11th horn that arises, which takes over the other 3 horns. And in this horn there were eyes like a man and a mouth speaking great things. And so this 11th horn that comes out is the Antichrist, or a human that's going to be looked up to. And as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. And let me go back to that last verse. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one. And that, as we go on through history, was Nero. And then as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Ancient of Days refers to God. God takes his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. And you remember in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that the stone hit the feet and its image crumbled, and it was cast down. In verse 9, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. So here is the prophecy of judgment that will take place. So all these horns were cast down until Daniel saw the throne of God, the Ancient of Days, and all the splendor and glory surrounding the throne of God. When we look at Revelation chapter 4, we see God sitting upon the throne. And we see the green emerald rainbow about the throne of God. And we see the crystal sea in front of it. And we see the 24 elders with their golden crowns there also before the throne of God, and the cherubim surrounding him and declaring, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty." We see the brightness of God as he sits there on the throne. And then our attention is diverted to the scroll that is in the right hand of God, because an angel is proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to take this scroll and to loose the seals?" And then we turn and we see Jesus as a lamb that has been slaughtered, and he comes forth and he takes the scroll out of the right hand of him who sits upon the throne. And we watched them as they offered the golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints, and began to sing, "Worthy is the Lamb to take the scroll and loose the seals for he was slain, and he has been redeemed by his blood out of all the nations." So this scene in heaven is followed immediately, that we see here, by the book, or by the book being opened. Then the scroll is opened in Revelations and actually brings judgment. Not the great white throne judgment, but the judgment of God upon Christ rejecting the world, which is, as I mentioned, described in Revelations 6 through 18. So Daniel and John had corresponding visions of the throne of God and the glory of the throne of God and the impending judgment upon man. In verse 11, "Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire." So here we're told concerning the beast, the man of sin, the son of perdition, commonly called the Antichrist, that he speaks great blasphemous things against the God of heaven, and he finally declares that he himself is God and demands to be worshipped as a God. And he puts to death those that refuse to worship him. He kept repeating the last part of verse 11, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. We're told in the book of Revelation that when Jesus comes again, that he will destroy the instrument of Satan, the man of sin, and he will be cast into the lake that burneth with fire. So here in Daniel and Revelation, here again, they're running parallel side by side. The other beast had been stripped of their authority in verse 12, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Does that sound familiar? Was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So now we're seeing, or Daniel is seeing in his dream, Jesus Christ and the receiving of the glorious kingdom that is going to be given to Jesus to reign, and a kingdom that will never end. In Isaiah 9, verse 6, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. The government shall be upon his shoulders, and he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting, the Prince of Peace. And the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David, to order and to establish it in righteousness and in judgment from henceforth and forever. And in Luke 1, verses 30, fear not, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you will, in talking to Mary, you will receive and bear a son, and thou shalt him, Jesus, and he shall be great. For he shall be called the Son of the Highest, and God shall give him unto the throne of his father David. He will reign over Jacob, and his kingdom there shall be no end. So Daniel got a beautiful insight into all of this, of what was going to happen. And he sees Jesus coming with the clouds, coming to the Ancient of Days, receiving the authority, the dominion, the glory, the kingdom that all of the world he would rule. And also over in Psalms 2, God tells Jesus, ask of me, and I will give unto you the heathen of thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possessions, the glorious kingdom of God. So continuing in the last part there, 15, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. So these are the kingdoms that are going to rule over the earth, but the saints eventually take the kingdom. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. So there in verse 22, until the Ancient of Days, which is until God comes and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people. We can remember in Corinthians, Paul rebuked the Corinthians and the church of Corinth, and he said, what are you doing taking your brother to a pagan judge, suing them before the courts of the land? You ought to be settling these things in the church. Don't you know the saints are going to judge the world? And so judgment is given to the saints. In verse 23, he gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times of the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. And this is for like a 3.5-year period that he will rule. Coming to Jerusalem, making war against Israel. And during the first 3.5 years of his reign, he'll make a treaty with Israel. And as we get in next week, hopefully, or the week after, when we get into chapter 9, we'll see where this treaty is actually broken. But in 26, but the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So, Daniel chapter 7 is really a complex text, as you can see. And it's interpreted various ways through various theological ideas and historical lenses. But there's 5 lessons that I've garnered from this chapter 7. Number 1 is God's sovereignty over the human empires. Daniel in this chapter described a vision of 4 great beasts, each different from the others, rising from the sea. And these beasts are interpreted as symbolizing the successive empires or kingdoms that have significant influence over the world events. And despite the power and terror of these empires, they are ultimately under God's control. And God has the ultimate authority, and these earthly kingdoms, as all earthly kingdoms, are temporary.
Does it say what are the 4 kingdoms? You said the Babylon?
Yeah, you have Babylon, you have Medo-Persian, you have Greece, and you have Rome. Yeah. And then also in chapter 7, this vision suggests that the earthly powers, no matter how intimidating, are only temporary and they will be replaced. And so that kind of gives me confidence in today's world that regardless of our political upheaval or political circus that we may have going on, that God is in control. And all of this is temporary, and he will eventually replace it all. The Daniel's vision also includes the appearance of one like a son of man, who is given authority, glory, and sovereign power by the Ancient of Days. And if you haven't noticed, I keep referring to the Ancient of Days is referring to God, and the Son of Man is, as we see in the New Testament, is referring to Jesus. And the key lesson there is that there's a promise of an everlasting kingdom that will replace, as I mentioned, the temporary and often oppressive rulers that we have here on earth. And God's kingdom is characterized by justice, righteousness, and eternal peace. And Daniel, in his reaction to his vision, includes distress and seeking understanding, but the importance of faithfulness and seeking God during confusing and troubling times. And so we're encouraged to remain steadfast in our faith, even when faced with trials or when the future may seem uncertain. But it also includes, the vision also concludes with all the beasts being defeated and God's kingdom being established. So we know that there is eventual victory of good over evil, and serves as a reassurance that God's plan includes the eventual triumph and establishment with peace on earth. You know, as we get ready to move into chapter 8, I wanted to go over a little history of the Grecian Empire, because going through history, Greece is in chapter 6, in verse 6, I looked up and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule, which is Greece. And Greece was not one of the big empires. And it was kind of thought, who's Greece? But Greece is thought to have begun at about the time of the biblical judges in the 12th century, so 1200 BC. And included in this history was the Trojan War, which we may or may not have studied in history in school. And the beginning of the authentic Greek history is usually started with the first Olympiad, which was held in 776 BC. The Persian Wars were from 500 to 331 BC, with famous battles taking place at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. And the formation of the empire was begun by Philip of Macedon, the king of Macedonia, in 359 BC. And he laid the foundation of the Greek Empire by uniting the Greek city-states under one single ruler. And he wanted to lead a united Greece against Persia. And so he trained his son, Alexander, to carry out his ambition. And in 343, at the age of 13, Alexander was tutored under Aristotle. Philip appointed him a regent of Greece when he was only 16 years old. And at age 20, upon his father's death, he assumed the command of the Greek army. And in the spring of 334, he crossed the Hellespont River with 35,000 men and began to take conquest of the Persian Empire. He defeated the Persians at the Granicus River in Asia Minor. He then cut the Gordian knot in the temple of Zeus, and he defeated the Persians at Issus at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And they conquered Persians numbering 600,000, and including Darius III and their ruler. And Darius III ran away to Susa to raise up another army. And so then Alexander turned his attention to Tyre on the Phoenician coast. And then he captured Tyre. And then in fulfillment, he captured Tyre. Isaiah in 740 BC had prophesied of the destruction of Tyre by the Chaldeans, which was in Isaiah 23. And then it came to pass just before the destruction of Jerusalem, which we studied, was in 586. Nebuchadnezzar, as prophesied by Ezekiel, was its destroyer, and a new city of Tyre was built on an island offshore, but Zechariah prophesied that this would be smitten in the sea and devoured with fire. And in fulfillment of that prophecy, in 332 BC, Alexander destroyed Tyre by building a causeway from the mainland to the island. And after a siege of 7 months, 8,000 inhabitants were slain and 30,000 were sold into slavery. The destruction of Tyre is considered one of the greatest military achievements of Alexander the Great. And then the capture of Jerusalem. After the destruction of Tyre, Alexander entered the land of Israel. After the victory at Tyre, Alexander actually hastened to Jerusalem, and he was met by Jadua, the high priest, as the head of a long procession of people dressed in white, while the priest was dressed in purple and scarlet. God had warned him in a dream the previous night to do this, and so Alexander approached Jadua alone and saluted him, indicating that he had seen this very person, Jadua, in a dream in Macedonia, thus believing that his army was under divine conduct. Alexander refused to allow his soldiers to harm the Jews and accompanied them back to Jerusalem. And he went up to the temple and was shown the book of Daniel, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, and he supposed that himself was the person that was intended for that. And so Alexander allowed the Jews to continue in their laws and religion and to pay no tribute each seventh year, as was the custom in the Jewish custom. And when the Samaritans saw this treatment, they claimed to be Jews also. Doesn't surprise me. From Jerusalem, Alexander went to Egypt, where he founded the city of Alexandria. And then from Egypt, he marched to the Persian capital. He marched to the Indus River, conquering buildings and cities there. And then he returned to Babylon in 323 BC. He had plans to make it the new capital of the commercial empire, but it was never to be inhabited, as we see in prophecy of Isaiah 13, 20 through 22. And he died there of a fever at age 32. But the Greek influence on the world was very great and heavy, as you see all the different gods that are worshipped, Zeus and all of those. But after Alexander's death, then the kingdom was divided into, as I mentioned earlier, among his four generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And Cassander ruled Macedonia. So that's kind of a in-between here, because of the fact that Greece was a very powerful empire during this time. So let's move into chapter 8. And as with chapter 7, chapter 8 precedes chapter 5 chronologically, and this dream probably occurred around 551 BC, when Daniel was about 70 years old. In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. And in my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. So the Medo-Persian Empire was represented by two horns, the Persian Empire being the higher, coming up last, and was more powerful than the Median Empire. Verse 4, I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became great. And I was thinking about this. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. So in his dream, he was watching this ram, which is the Medo-Persian Empire, as it was conquering, but suddenly comes a goat out of the west. And this was Greece and Alexander the Great. And they were in his dream, they were conquering so fast that, their feet weren't touching the ground. And, in our history classes, we've read of Alexander the Great and all of his conquest and how fast he was able to conquer the world at that time. In verse 6, it came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So this is a pretty graphic prophecy, an interesting prophecy. And only by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that great horn, Alexander, would be broken in his youth. So, and we read that he, at 32 years old, was when he died, and the Grecian Empire passed on to 4 other generals, and Syria, Antiochus, and then, of course, out of Egypt came Asia Minor and Greece. And out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. So Antiochus, who moved against Egypt down toward the south, and of course he was passing from Syria into Egypt, and he had to go through the land of Israel. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." So this is a prophecy concerning Antiochus Epiphanes. And in studying all this, which has been very challenging, as you can see, he's talking about the profaning of the temple by Antiochus. And when he came to Jerusalem to show his disregard to for God and their beliefs, he sacrificed a pig upon the holy altar there in Jerusalem. And he sought to turn the temple back into a pagan temple. And this created an incensed feeling among the Jewish people. And a group of men came to Jerusalem and defeated the Syrian army that was there. And this is where the Feast of Dedication comes from that we studied from Hanukkah, when we studied that in Hanukkah. They wanted to reestablish the true worship, and interestingly enough, it was 2,300 days after Antiochus had profaned the temple, just as it was showed here in his vision. So now we have in verse 15, "While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, 'Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision.'" Now here we have Gabriel the angel, and how many times has the angel Gabriel appeared throughout the Bible? "As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. 'Son of man,' he said to me, 'understand that the vision concerns the time of the end.'" So, as I mentioned, Gabriel is telling him, explaining to him the vision. And we're gonna read more about him in next week's chapter 9. But because Gabriel is also what? Gabriel's the angel that came to Mary and told her that she was to have a child. And he came to Zacharias, the priest, and let him know that his wife Elizabeth would have a child, John the Baptist. And he said, "How can I know this?" He said, "I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God." So Gabriel's a very interesting angel, and he's going to explain to Daniel what it's all about. "As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia." So we don't need to question what the ram is or who the ram is, for he tells us they're the kings of Media and Persia, and the shaggy goat is the king of Greece. And of course, this is when Greece was nothing. And the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, or Alexander the Great. That's the first king during the time of his conquering. So Philip, Alexander's father, did not conquer or begin any kind of world conquest. That would be the first king in its conquering efforts. So the four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. So, and this is true of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, it did happen. Continuing in 23, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. And he will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. We read over in, talking about parallel, we read over in Revelation 13 that the beast that rises out of the sea, that Satan gives him the authority and his power. And so this man of sin is going to arise, and he's going to be tremendously powerful, but not by his own power. It will be Satan's power that will be vested in him. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. So he's going to make war against Israel. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So we have the brightness, the hope, the promise of the coming of Jesus Christ, which goes forth out of the mouth of Christ, that he will be broken, he will be destroyed without a hand touching him. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. So angel's telling him, just close it up because it's for the future. Daniel says, I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. And then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision, as it was beyond understanding. So this was, I didn't realize it was so late. So this was all, it's, at that time it was so difficult to understand, but we have the blessings of the whole Bible. And so we have history. And so it's clearer to us of everything. And so the interpretation of this, the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, symbolizing its power. The two horns represent the Medes and the Persians. The goat symbolizes the Greek Empire, and the prominent horn represents Alexander the Great, and the breaking of this horn and the rise of the four others indicate the division of Alexander's empire after his death. The small horn, often interpreted as Antiochus, a ruler who came from one of the four divisions of the Greek Empire. He's known for his persecution of the Jews and desecration of the temple, symbolizing a great adversary of God's people. The time of tribulation foretells a period of great suffering and persecution for the holy people, and the cleansing of the sanctuary. This concludes the vision with the promise of the sanctuary being cleansed and restored, which is the symbol of hope and divine justice. Chapter 8 is another complex but rich chapter in the book of Daniel. And it's been a challenge to kind of go through all this, needless to say. So I hope you're not as confused as I was studying it. And it's 2:45, so we probably better close with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank Thee for this day. We thank Thee for the book of Daniel. We thank Thee for Your word in the Bible in total. Father, it's such a blessing to be able to